Good morning. Welcome to class again together. We're glad that you've joined me today as we continue our study of Moses. Today we're going to take one of the most important events in Hebrew history. It is the time where Israel crossed the Red Sea, but all the things that led it up to it are just as important. Most of us grow up in some way. They tend to learn that they're not as important as they believe they are, and really how much they need others. People tend to learn that life has troubles, and so they need to stick with it regardless of what the trouble is. And they need to learn to trust, and those to trust and those to avoid. Sometimes that has a pricey lesson that goes with it. But what does it take to grow up? We all wish there was a book somewhere that if you read it, it would solve all of maturity problems. But even with the best advice, hearts get broken, lives take detours, and challenges arise. It takes slow and intentional training and experience to grow into maturity. That was true about Moses himself. So far in this series, we have seen where Moses had to learn to follow God rather than himself. He had to learn to wait on God's timing and trust God's methods. And don't we all need that lesson? But Moses had another role. He must lead Israel from being slaves to being sons. Now think of the challenge of that. Your bondage restricts and destroys your ability to make choices. You're forced into submission, so you are being told what to do all the time. But last week, we heard what God told he would do for Israel. It says, "Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the burdens of Egypt. And I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give you it for a possession. I am the Lord." Think of the promises. God's going to take these people afflicted under the whip of Egyptian taskmasters, deliver them, take them for his own, bring them to a land, and let them live in it. It seems like a fairy tale to a slave. At the front of the line, God bringing God's promises to fruition is Moses. How is God training his people to become what he wants them to be? In this lesson, three things occur that will contribute to Israel's learning to be the children of God. And all three apply to us as well. First, he gives them a family tradition. Perhaps you have family traditions. For years, we lived in the Houston area, and on Christmas Eve, we would dress up in our nice clothes. We would drive downtown. We would see the Nutcracker. Then we'd eat at the Spaghetti Warehouse. It was something you did every year, something you looked forward to, and something that even today I look back and say, that's what we did, and that's who we are. Family traditions cement you as that you're part of a family. And it becomes very important that it will become the center of the new calendar of Israel. And everything in life will begin to revolve around this simple act we call Passover. And so in Exodus chapter 12, before the reality of leaving Egypt, God gives these instructions. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. If you are a slave, just think about how strange those instructions sound. That's not what we've done. That's not how we do it. That's not what we normally do. They had specific cooking instructions. They never cooked a lamb like this without cleaning it, without either boiling it. They took the time with it. But now it had to be roasted quickly, and it had to be served with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. No one eats that. You let the bread rise. You don't eat herbs that bother you. But all things had a purpose. And then God had them paint the doorpost with the blood of that lamb. No one does that. That's so strange that it took place only in Goshen. Who does things like that? When they ate, they didn't sit down. Instead, they ate this meal both quickly and standing up as if you were in a hurry to leave. And they had their traveling clothes on, and for slaves, they never went anywhere. Why do you wear this, especially to have a meal together? Why don't we just sit regularly as we do and have a leisurely meal as we always have? But now they would count the days from this moment. How do you retool an entire culture in a single night? But it had another function. It engendered curiosity from the youngest. Everything was so strange that you can almost imagine, and you knew that it was going to happen. Papa, why are we doing all of this? And the smallest child would voice the question that would prompt the answer. And the answer would be that this night, something dramatic would happen, something that would alter their lives, something that would change their destinies. Something was going to happen. The why was God was doing something great. But it had a purpose behind it. The truth is, this isn't a random command. God knows that lives are changed by repetitive actions. Now, isn't that true about you? Doesn't it, when you do dental hygiene, is it random or is it something regular? Do you brush your teeth every day around the same time? Yeah, I'm sure you do. But how about getting up? Well, I'm an early riser, always have been. Now, does that change my view of the day? Well, yes, it does. Because if I sleep in, I don't feel quite as good. The routine is what is there. It's important. Those repetitive acts change how you view life. There are some people who maintain an exercise routine, and they put their running shoes out the night before they go to bed. Great cooks assemble their tools and ingredients so they can cook deliberately. Those are repetitive actions, things people do all the time, and it does change how they live. And teachers understand these principles. Studies have shown that different teaching styles affect how much someone learns. If you just read something, it hardly even registers. But if you show them a picture, understanding and memory goes up 3 times. Add a lecture to that picture and half of the lesson gets caught. Now ask them to teach what they learned to someone else, and learning goes way up again. But then if that person continually practices what they have learned, each day becomes perfect memory and performance. No wonder God chose what fits man. And God was also giving them something that no matter what was happening in their lives, this was something that they could definitely circle on their calendar. It provided a stability when things were unstable. In the centuries to come, they would have plenty of instability, and they would need an anchor for their faith, something to bring them back to center, to realign them with the eternal, their purpose, and their relationship. So what makes all this effective? Well, why the Passover is effective, it takes looking at the elements of it. First, it's specific and scheduled. You know what to do and when to do it. There's no guesswork. You don't have to sit down in a meeting and say, now, exactly when are we going to do Passover this year? I don't think April's a good time. Why don't we postpone it till the fall? Well, fall's not good for me because I travel during that time. I would rather have it, you say, in January. Well, January is too cold. Nobody. You think about the problems we have when we try to schedule anything. No one can say this is not convenient because it's the same time every year. You block out your calendar. This is what's going to take place. But secondly, it's concrete and not conceptual. There is an idea behind Passover, but it was celebrated with bread without yeast, something you can feel, handle, see, and taste. They had a roasted lamb that you would eat in your mouth. They put on traveling clothes, an act that seemed to be strange. It had specific instruction. They stood at the table, something that you don't normally do. It was very, very specific, very, very concrete. You could see it, you could do it. The elements were physical. And they affected not just the mind, but the body as well. That cements things as a full body experience. But the third was repetitive and regular. In spite of the protest that it might get stale, we hear that all the time, repetitive things tend to get kept. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. It's Passover. Get the lamb, scour the house, clean out the leaven. You know what to do. It's event oriented. It is pegged to something that happened that is so significant that you cannot miss it in your life. They have this as a historical peg, the night that the Lord freed them from Egyptian slavery. They could relive events year after year, tell the story, and be participants in the drama. And finally, it focused on the why question. It caused each generation to scratch their heads and ask again the ancient question, why are we doing this? The gray heads could relate the story. One day, those children would be the gray heads. And it would never be, someone was a slave. The story pattern answered it. We were slaves in Egypt. Our family is part of a larger heritage. A nation has lived for centuries. Red Craddock tells a story that he took a trip to Israel. He hired an Israeli guide, and one of the places they visited was Mount Megiddo. Now, if you don't know about Mount Megiddo, it's where we get the term Armageddon from. It is where Josiah the king fought against the Babylonian army and lost. And that was the beginning of the end for Judah. But as the guide told the story, he told it such vivid detail of where the armies were and where the thrust was and where Josiah must have fallen, that Fred Craddock said, it sounds like you were there. And the man said, I was. That was the sense of Passover. I am there. It connects the past with the present and the past with the future. So what does that have to do with us? That sounds like a nice history lesson or study in cross-cultural studies. But I find it interesting that Jesus chose the Passover meal as the moment to institute the Lord's Supper because all the elements were there. It was about an event of deliverance, and it had tangible reminders, unleavened bread representing a body, and fruit of the vine mirroring the blood. It was done regularly and repetitively every first day of the week by the early church. They never forgot, they never changed, they never altered. And it taught a lesson that we are freed by the blood of Christ. And every time we take it, I am there again at the cross. So why do we believe as we do? There's the reason. Never let someone tell you the Lord's Supper is easily changed. They're fools. When Israel started monkeying with the Passover, they started dispensing with it. And once they dispensed with it, they dispensed with their faith too. If we don't keep what God said in God's way, the same fate awaits us. But the second great thing that Moses has to show the people for them to become the children of God is he had to show them God's greatest deliverance. But the Passover was just a prelude, you see. For the event would mark the night. And finally, with staff in hand, loins girded, lamb eaten, with the final fires in place and the blood on the door, night fell. A final plague would befall Egypt, but it was far less apparent and more deeply felt. Houses adorned with the blood of the Lamb in response to Moses' instructions would find a son or would not find a son or daughter dead in their beds, but those that were clear of the blood, you could only hear wailing. It's a stark report in Exodus. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his office officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Think of the night, dark as pitch, a moonless night. There's no electric lights, and so it is dark. The stars adorn the sky. And in the quiet, all you can hear is the wailing of mothers who cannot be helped, of fathers holding bodies of children, wondering why they went to bed healthy and died in the middle of the night. No one was exempt. While Pharaoh could remain detached from 9 of these, this one he could not ignore. I'm sure he held the lifeless body of his own firstborn. It was true from palace to prison to barn and manger. The sound of wailing filled the air of Egypt. Now there was no missing the point. This is God, the I Am, as Moses would call him. And he held the power of life and death in his hands, and now it was entirely possible that the nation could be eradicated if the Israelites stayed. So Pharaoh initiated this final meeting that he said he would never have again. And Moses and Aaron were summoned in the middle of the night. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the God you've requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you said, and go. And also bless me." And the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. For otherwise, they said, we will all die. It was time for history to be made. In our first lesson, we stood under the canopy of stars with Abraham. There in Genesis chapter 15, God makes him a promise. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that's not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions." Now this ancient promise was not just a message flung into the air. It was God working at precisely the right time to accomplish what he had planned. In Exodus 12:41 rings history's gong. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. 15 generations had passed. It would take reams of papyrus to contain the names of all who lived and died with the promise of the future. People had never moved. They had not relocated at all in 4 centuries. It was a massive movement of at least 1 million slaves who had lived and died under the taskmaster's whip. But one thing was clear. These are people who had never experienced freedom. Something happens when you experience freedom. You use it poorly. When I was in college, several college freshmen who always came from good families who had always gone to church, but they had parents always pushing them to get up on Sunday and attend worship. But now when they got to college, without restriction, they did as they pleased. This would be a dangerous time if they believed they were independent of God. So they left Egypt and headed out to a new world. It says that the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. Many joined them, and that would prove difficult for Moses in the years to come, but for now, they celebrated their freedom. But freedom has a problem. You soon realize that free people don't know what to do. They need guidance. And so now, God shows them the third thing they need to do and to be children. They have to follow his lead. They come out of Egypt to come to Succoth, where they camp, and the mass of people spread on the desert floor. The people thought they could handle anything. They were heady with self-confidence. And it says that they were ready for battle in Exodus 13, verse 18. But they needed something, as we soon shall see. They'd only known Egypt. In the desert, you become disoriented. No landmarks with which we're familiar existed. You could get lost and wander and die. So God provides a solution. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to guide them, give them light, so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Whenever the cloud was in the day, there was a guide. At night, the fire lit up the sky, and they learned to follow it. God was not leaving them alone. He was always there. But soon they would face a greater challenge. They believed they were ready for battle, but the very first test, proved them wrong. God knew the mind of Pharaoh and how overconfident he was. He voices it to Moses. For Pharaoh will say to the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, and the land has shut them in, and the wilderness has shut them in. He believed that he could repent now and overtake them and seize them, and they would be stuck between the wilderness and the sea. He would seize as many as he could and kill the rest. But God had one final lesson to teach Pharaoh. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. He was going to prove indeed that the Lord was more powerful than the most powerful army on the earth, the one who had conquered the Hittite Empire, who had solidified the ancient Near East in a single empire. It would be something witnessed by the people, and for they, the people of Israel, needed to be convinced as well. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away in the wilderness to die? What is this you have done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not what we said to you in Egypt, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in this wilderness. Israel still did not have confidence in either Moses' leadership or God's power. They were prepared to surrender. So God had one great demonstration of power, something that would become the linchpin of history and identity for the people. Moses stood at the rim of the Red Sea, lifted his arms above the water, and spoke to Israel. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Three phrases stand out. First, stand and see. It was time to witness God's power in its fullness. They had watched 10 plagues, but still unconvinced. And now this final one that would eradicate the Egyptian army would force them to see what God can do. with their own eyes. Secondly, the Lord will fight for you. They will not fight this battle. It will not be up to them. God is the general and the army all rolled into one. Stand and watch God work, for He is the one who will deliver you. Always. Never forget. And finally, they only had to be silent. Here's where God will show them His care, His guidance, and His deliverance. So God caused an east wind to blow, and He parted the sea, and the result was dramatic. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, and the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left hand. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in His servant Moses. Israel saw the Egyptian dead washing up on the shores. But the passage adds that they saw the great power the Lord had used. As a result, they believed. God had not just brought them out of Egypt, but He also saved them from certain death. He taught them that they could rely on His guidance and on His servant Moses. When the prophet Hosea reflects on this moment, he frames it as a family experience. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Here was a father loving a child, but training him to be a son, to depend on his father. So how God did it for Israel is how He does it for us. God trains us through keeping contact to our roots. In the Passover, He gave Israel a way to keep the events of the Exodus alive from generation to generation. Each generation could relive and re-experience the very first time. It would become the family story. And that's true for us. In the Lord's Supper, we kept the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus alive. When Jesus instituted the supper, He said, "Keep it in remembrance of me." And each week we connect to the event that changed our lives. We experience the body and the blood. We again stand at a cross on a hill called Golgotha. We hear the cries and the screams, the weeping of mothers, and the words, "It is finished," bowed head. Never neglect that which keeps you in touch with the roots of your faith. Second is that God trains us through His power over life and death. When God passed over the land, He took life from the Egyptians and preserved life for the Israelites. He can cause things to live or die. He showed He controlled both life and death. No deity can do that. No ruler can do that. No political party can do that. No nation can do that. We are at the mercy of life and death. So it is with us. Jesus in His resurrection broke the bonds of death and rendered it powerless. Paul would tell the Corinthians, the sting of death is sin. The power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. We serve a God who holds life and death in His hands, who has broken the back of death and its finality for those who will believe and obey. But the third is that God trains us through His daily care for us. When Israel turned to the desert, they were absolutely helpless. Yet, in greatest distress, God protected and cared and delivered. Without the power of God, they could not have survived. But He used His power to care for His child. Peter knew we could be in no better hands. He said, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on Him, because He cares for you." God had taken slaves out of Egypt and was bringing them into his family. A slave can be made to obey, but a son must be taught to trust. And isn't that what God is doing in your life and mine? Thank you for joining me today. I hope you have enjoyed our class together and gotten much out of it. We will be back next week with another lesson on Moses as we learn they go forward into the wilderness and have to learn so many more lessons. So thanks again for being with me, and I hope you have a great day. May God be with you this week. And I'll see you next week.